Hello everyone and welcome back to the Ultimate Beginner's Guide to Automotive Photography. You are now on section 6, Understanding Adobe Lightroom. Now before we get started, something that I would like to mention is that there are tons of alternatives to Adobe Lightroom as well as Adobe Photoshop. However, the bulk of my editing experience is in these two programs, therefore that's the information I'm going to be sharing with you in this guide. So with that being said, let's talk a little bit about what Adobe Lightroom actually is. Adobe Lightroom is a program that allows you to import photo files, adjusting them through a series of characteristics to customize the photo to look exactly how you want it. You're able to adjust things like exposure, highlights, shadows, blacks, whites, etc. You can even add your own custom colors to your photo within Adobe Lightroom, which we will be exploring later on in this section. So without further ado, let's go ahead and actually open Adobe Lightroom and show you which parts of the program are important to you. Now, when you first open up Lightroom, you may be taken to a few different menus, but the first thing that you want to do right off the bat is go up into File and hit Import Photos and Video. This is actually how you bring your photos into Adobe Lightroom. Now, this is where that piece of gear, an external hard drive that I mentioned in a prior section, is going to come in handy. If you've just got done taking photos with your camera, you're going to need to remove your camera's SD card, plug it into your computer, and then transfer those photos off of your SD card, either onto your computer or onto a hard drive. For me, I personally use an external hard drive, and I organize all of my raw photos by their date. I make individual folders on my hard drive for each individual set that I do, name it the date that I took the photos on, and that makes it extremely easy for me to find these photo sets later. So once you hit import, you are going to see this menu here. Now these are all the different destinations on your computer where photos could be located. For me, like I said earlier, I store my photos on my external hard drive, which is titled My Passport. I click this arrow down here and I find the date of the set that I'm looking to edit. For the purposes of this video, we're going to be using my most recent set from Willow Springs Raceway in Roseman, California. Now in this menu here, it is showing you every single photo that you have in this folder. So from here, you have the ability to click this uncheck all button and check manually which photos you'd actually like to edit. If you select more than one photo from this menu here, you'll be able to quickly jump back and forth between different photos in this set, as opposed to having to go back into the import photo and video section to import a new photo each time you're done. But for this demonstration, I'm gonna go ahead and just grab one photo to edit and load it up on the computer for you. I'm going to be using this photo of this Avis Blue E36M3 to show you around Lightroom. Once you found a photo that you like, go ahead and click on Include and Import down at the bottom of your screen, and then hit Import on the right side of your screen. This will pull you into the Library tab where, again, if you selected multiple photos, you'd be able to see all of them here. Since I only just imported the one, we're only seeing the one. Once you've highlighted the photo that you'd like to edit, you're going to go to the top right of your screen where it says Develop and click that tab. This is going to reveal all of the editing tools that you have at your disposal while using Adobe Lightroom. Now, there is a ton of stuff to go over in this program, so get comfortable and grab a pen and paper. The first item that we are going to talk about is here at the top right of your screen. It is this nice colorful graph. Now this graph is referred to as a histogram, and as you can see as I hover my cursor over the histogram, going from left to right, these different graph points represent the values of your blacks, shadows, exposure, and your highlights and whites in this graph. Not only will this tell you if certain parts of your photo are peaking, meaning their values are too high, but it will even specify what colors are peaking. This graph is a great tool to use to give you an idea of what a photo needs edited before you even get to doing anything. Just below the histogram, you will also notice that all of your camera's settings that it had when you took this photo will appear up there as well. Just below that, you will see this toolbar containing 5 editing tools. The first of which is the Edit tool, which just pulls up the menus you already see below in this right-hand side. The next tool is the Crop Overlay tool. This is the tool that allows you to actually crop your image. Now you could just grab the corners and manually adjust it this way, but for me, I always like my photos to have an aspect ratio of 16:9. So I go ahead and I click this first, and I make any adjustments from here. Having the ability to select aspect ratios within this menu here is extremely helpful if you ever have a client that requests specific aspect ratios for their photos. Like I mentioned in a prior section, if you're working with somebody who wants photos either for their website or for social media, a lot of times they're going to ask for the aspect ratio of 4:5 shown here. But because this photo is just to demonstrate for you guys, I'm gonna leave it at 16:9 because I think that looks the best. One other thing I should mention, if you hover your cursor towards the middle of the crop line down here, that gives you the ability to actually rotate the photo. Now the crop tool is great for straightening out your photos, but keep in mind, later in the section I'm gonna be going over a different portion of Lightroom that also helps with straightening and aligning your photos. The next tool that we have up on the toolbar is the healing tool. Now this is a fairly new addition to Adobe Lightroom, so if you are running anything other than the most recent version of Adobe Lightroom, you may not have this function. However, this feature has been in Photoshop forever, so if you follow my advice and get Lightroom and Photoshop, no worries, you'll still have access to this heal tool. With that being said, the way that it works in Lightroom is you go ahead and click the tool up here and you will notice that a circle is going to appear on screen. You can use the bracket keys on your keyboard to either make it bigger or make it smaller, but essentially what this allows you to do is remove any unwanted objects from your photo contained within that circle. So for example, you'll notice that there's a few things down on the ground here. I will go ahead and click this circle over those items, and you'll notice it is removing them from the photo. Now, sometimes this tool works really, really well, and sometimes it doesn't really work that great, depending on how much detail the item you're trying to remove has in the original photo. That being said though, you can sometimes change the results of how your objects are removed by changing between the content aware move, the heal, and the clone modes up here at the top. Each has their own unique way of using software to determine how to get rid of a particular object that you're asking it to remove. So if you're ever using one method and it's not working, try the other two before giving up. The next tool here is red eye correction. If you're doing car photos, you're really not ever going to use this tool. And the last but certainly not least tool listed on this toolbar is the masking tool. Now, just like with the heal tool, this is a fairly new addition to Lightroom, at least in the capacity that it's showing up on my screen. Adobe has added recently a bunch of new features that make the masking tool much more useful, but again, if you're not running the most recent version of Lightroom, you may not have this. So up here at the top, you'll see these three options under the text Add New Mask. You can either select Subject, Sky, or Background. This does exactly what you think it does. These three options here will individually select either the subject, the sky, or the background in your photo, allowing you to make individual adjustments to either the subject, sky, or background, depending on what you selected. It goes even deeper than that though. Go a little bit down and you'll notice that there is this button for objects. Let's say you selected subject, for example, but the AI wasn't smart enough to figure out what the subject in your photo was. For some reason, my Lightroom is currently broken, so it almost never works properly. So here I went to select my subject and it didn't do a perfect job. So something that you can do is go up here to Create New Mask, select Objects instead. Here you'll see you have two modes, Brush Select or Rectangle Select. And what these allow you to do, with Rectangle Select, you just draw a box around the item that you would like to adjust, and the AI will figure out what you're trying to select. Again, my Lightroom is broken, that's why it's showing up as a big square, but for you, it should automatically detect the car. From there, you can play with these settings here, which we'll explain later, allowing you to individually adjust whatever object you want. Now, let's say you don't want to make any AI suggestions. Maybe you're in a spot like me, where your Lightroom's not working properly and you need to manually select something that you'd like to adjust. Simply click on the brush tool and you'll see another circle showing up in front of your photo. Click down your cursor and you will notice this red, almost paint, showing up over where you're dragging your mouse. Now, everything that's being covered in this red paint, so to speak, you're going to be able to adjust individually. So for example, let me just draw a little V on the ground here. If I raise the exposure, not only is it brightening the car, but it is also grabbing down here. It's worth mentioning, if you hold the Alt key, you can erase any selection that you made, making it extremely easy to just generally paint over a car, and then come back in later with the eraser to clean up the edges. Again, Lightroom has worked really hard with a lot of these new masking features to make it to where you don't ever really need to brush anything anymore, but the feature is still in there in case those other functions don't work. Next up below brush, you have linear gradient. This tool essentially allows you to drag a gradient selection over your photo. This may sound confusing. Let me show you how you're going to use it as a car photographer. For me, one of my favorite things to do is drag a linear filter towards the bottom of the photo. I'm then able to lower the exposure, and it creates this leading shadow that goes into the subject of my photo. Furthermore, you can also use a linear gradient to add a bit of sunlight from any given part of your photo. So I will drag it up in the top right-hand corner, turn it up, and you'll see how it kind of emphasizes that the sun is coming from this angle. And the last tool in masking that I'm going to teach you guys about is this radial gradient here. This is similar to the linear gradient, except instead of making a line, it creates a circle. My most common use for this would be drawing a circle around the middle of my subject, coming up here to this invert button in the top right corner, clicking that to select just the edges of the photo, and reducing the exposure to create a vignette. Now, there are other ways to create vignettes within Adobe Lightroom. That's just my preferred method of doing it. The next two objects under masking are color range and luminance range. This essentially allows you to make individual adjustments to either specific colors or specific items that all match the same brightness, but as I'm going to show you later, there are other tools in Lightroom that allow you to do this a bit easier. Okay, so we have gotten all of the tools out of the way. Now it's time to get into the actual panels on the right-hand side of Lightroom. Let's go ahead and make adjustments to each of these sliders to demonstrate what they do. This first slider here is for temperature. Like I mentioned before, your temperature is how blue or how yellow your image is. This image looks a little too blue, so we're gonna go ahead and pull this more towards the yellow side until the ground looks a bit more natural. Let's go ahead and leave it there. Your next opportunity for adjustment is under the tint slider. Like I mentioned before, this is either how green or how purple your image is. I'm gonna go ahead and leave it right here at +9, as that seems like a pretty neutral tint for this photo. All right, coming down here into the tone section, you've got exposure, contrast, highlights, shadows, whites, and blacks. Exposure is going to cover the overall brightness of the entire photo. It's not really brightening up one specific area, rather it's brightening up the entire photo. Contrast, again, adds contrast to the overall entire image. You can see, look at the front end of this car. As I continue to turn the contrast up, the front of the car gets a little bit darker. As I reduce contrast, the details in the image start to come back, but it all starts looking a bit hazy. I kind of like the look of this photo at a -70 contrast rating, so let's go ahead and put that there for now. Okay, I'm going to define these next 4 terms in groups of 2. First, you have highlights and whites. Highlights deal with the brighter parts of your photo, whereas whites deal with the brightest parts of your photo. In my experience, you are going to be adjusting highlights and whites the most often to either get detail back in paint that's very bright colored, or get detail back in the sky that's been blown out due to sunny conditions. Take a look at what the sky looks like with the highlights value at +1, and watch what happens as I slowly start to bring it down. You're starting to get all of that detail back in the sky. Similarly, if you do the same thing to the whites, you will get a similar effect, but you'll notice that it's only affecting the absolute brightest parts of the image as opposed to all of the bright parts of the image. That may be a little bit of a confusing explanation, but I promise you, the more photos that you load into Lightroom and mess around with these sliders, the more you'll start to understand what they do. The next 2 terms are shadows and blacks, and they follow the same philosophy. Shadows cover the darker parts of your photos, where blacks cover the darkest parts of your photo. Many times you will see me turning up my shadows to get as much detail out of each part of the picture as I can, but I will reduce the blacks to still maintain some kind of contrast in the picture. Be really careful with shadows though. If you turn this up too high, it can give a really strange look to the tires, so just keep that in mind. So I have adjusted all the values on this photo to about where I want them to be. Let's now move down into the presence section, which contains texture, clarity, and dehaze. Texture is pretty self-explanatory. You turn this one up and it basically sharpens out the image, making everything in it look a lot more hard, if that makes sense. It really exaggerates all the individual lines and outlines throughout your photo. Clarity does a similar thing, but it has a much more drastic effect on contrast. A big mistake I see tons of beginning car photographers making is that they go absolutely insane with the clarity slider. Now listen, I'm not gonna roast, because for the first 2 years of my car photography career, I was definitely a clarity plus 100 type of guy. I understand it adds a really cool effect to your photos, but ultimately, because this look is available from simply such a slider, there are so many people who just crank this value up and produce photos that way, so it's a little bit difficult to create a unique style by utilizing this clarity function. So keep that in mind. You can use any of these features however you'd like, but use them sparingly. Next, we have dehaze. You'll notice that this increases the saturation of the colors quite a bit, as well as increasing contrast. Again, a little bit different than clarity, which does also increase contrast, but almost reduces saturation. The dehaze function is especially helpful if you are shooting on sunny days. Sometimes you will get this effect over your car that looks legitimately hazy. For example, I just turned the blacks value up to 46 to kind of emulate a hazy look. As we play with the dehaze slider, you'll notice that it's starting to bring the image back to life, removing those hazy elements. Let's go ahead and leave this photo here for right now, jumping over to vibrance and saturation. Vibrance and saturation both deal with the intensity of colors in your photo. The difference is that vibrance emphasizes the colors that are complementing each other within your photo, whereas saturation is simply just raising the intensity of every color in your photo. For that reason, I'm almost always turning saturation a little bit down while turning vibrance a little bit up. This helps me guarantee that there are mostly only complementary colors in my photos and no other colors that are conflicting with that scheme. For those who don't know, complementary color schemes are two colors that are on opposite ends of a color wheel. There are also tons of other color combinations that make up complementary color schemes. But the most popular ones that you will have heard of are orange and teal, blue and yellow, red and green. You can also go for something that's called a monochromatic style, which is where you feature different shades of the same color. Complementary colors and color science in general can definitely seem like a very intimidating subject to jump into. However, the nice thing about complementary colors and color science in general is that there are actually rules, more or less, to complementary colors. This means that you can write down a list of complementary colors, keep them with you while you're editing, and you can use those to determine what kind of look is best for the photo you have in front of you. Next, we are going to jump into what is undoubtedly my least favorite panel in Adobe Lightroom, and that is the tone curve. Now, I feel that I owe all of you the respect of actually explaining to you what the tone curve is and what it does, despite the fact that I absolutely hate using it and almost never do. As you can see here, the tone curve looks very similarly to the histogram. It is displaying your various values on a scale from shadows, darks, lights, to highlights. What the tone curve allows you to do is click on this graph to set points on this line here. Once you have these points set, they give you the ability to drag down the values, changing the highlights, shadows, blacks, and whites within your photo. Most commonly, you will see people advising you to achieve what is called an S-curve with your tone curve. What this essentially means is that you set your points up in this fashion to make your tone curve line appear as a letter S. This is a general good rule of thumb for achieving solid contrast out of your images. However, it is worth mentioning that everything within the tone curve can also be adjusted in the sliders within the basic tab, and that is where I am significantly more comfortable. There have been times that I've messed with the sliders and have been unable to achieve a look that I want, so I have to go into the tone curve in order to get there, but 9 times out of 10, I'm getting the looks that I'm going for by adjusting the sliders in the basic tab. So with that being said, I'm gonna go ahead and delete all of these points on the tone curve, reverting it right back to normal and continuing from there. It's also worth mentioning that not only do you have the ability to create a tone curve for your highlights, whites, blacks, and shadows, but you also have the ability to do it for your reds, greens, and blues. However, like with a few other things in this program, as we continue, I'm gonna show you that there is a bit of an easier way to manipulate the colors within Adobe Lightroom. The next panel that we're gonna talk about is actually my favorite panel in Adobe Lightroom. This is the HSL/color panel, and this is what I believe to be the most powerful panel in all of Lightroom. This panel breaks down into 3 sections: hue, saturation, and luminance. We're going to be using the blue slider to demonstrate how this section works. Hue allows you to change the tone of the colors in your image. So for example, if we move the blue slider more to the left, you'll notice that the blues are becoming more of a green color. If you move it over to the right, the blues become more of a purple color. Messing with the hue settings can be an excellent way at guaranteeing that the paint colors of the cars you're shooting actually match their real life colors. You're able to change the hue of each of the colors listed in this menu. But clicking over to saturation, you are now able to change the intensity of each of the individual colors in your image. So in this photo, for example, the blue in the sky is very intense, so I'm going to turn the blue saturation down. Knowing that we have those masking tools at our advantage, I don't mind that the car is not super saturated right now because I can paint the color blue back onto the car later. You can also see how turning up the red slider changes the amount of saturation in the red showing up in this barn here, as well as the taillight on the 911 behind it. And last but not least, you can come over to the luminance section, which allows you to change the brightness of each individual color. So again, raising the blue value makes the sky much brighter, as well as the blue paint on the car. Making it darker reduces the brightness of the paint on the car as well as the sky. I love these tools simply because they give you so much creative freedom as a car photographer and editor when putting your photos together. You can pinpoint exactly every color to look exactly how you want it. Being able to do that so easily within this panel makes it undoubtedly my favorite panel in Lightroom. Now below that, we have an equally as exciting section. This is the color grading panel. Here you will notice 3 color wheels, one for midtones, one for shadows, and one for highlights. Within this color wheel, you'll notice a circle in the center, as well as a circle slightly outside the color wheel to the right. The circle outside the wheel allows you to select from where on the wheel you are pulling color from. The circle in the middle allows you to choose how much saturation that particular color has in that given section of your image. This is again where understanding complementary colors can really play into your favor here. For example, yellow and blue is a complementary color scheme, so maybe I can add some yellows into my midtones, some yellows into my highlights, add a little tiny amount there, and then in our shadows, we'll add a little bit of blues. As you can see, there are endless combinations of how you can put these colors together. What I like to do is I like to grab the dot on the ends of the color wheels and just spin them all the way around until I see a color that jumps out to me. If you were going for a monochromatic color scheme, for example, you would want to make sure that each of the colors in each of these wheels were basically the same color. Again, million different combinations that you can do here. Part of the fun with Lightroom is experimenting with these types of tools. There is no right or wrong answer, just make the photos that you think look cool. Next section that we need to talk about is the detail panel. This is where you'll be adding sharpness and noise reduction to your images. You can adjust the sharpening with this amount slider here, and the radius, detail, and masking sliders will also allow you to adjust the intensity of what is being sharpened. If you hold your Alt key while moving around the Detail tab, you can actually see a faint outline of what is actually being sharpened in your photo. Same with the Masking slider Everything that you are seeing outlined is what is being sharpened, so the higher this masking is, the less sensitive and aggressive your sharpening is actually going to be. Down here you have noise reduction. Let's say you had to take a photo at a relatively high ISO value and you've got a little noise in your photo. You can either use the luminance slider or the color slider to remove noise from your photo. In my experience with car photos, the color slider has been the most effective for me at removing noise from my pictures. Next up, we have a pretty simple panel. This is the lens correction panel. Here you'll see two checkbox options, one for remove chromatic aberration and the other to enable profile corrections. Without getting too technical, chromatic aberration is essentially inconsistencies and discrepancies with the colors in your photos, especially when they get too bright. This is often represented by some kind of either purple or green highlight around something bright in your image. So, clicking the Remove Chromatic Aberration checkbox, the program will do its best to remove those discrepancies for you. The Enable Profile Corrections will get rid of any lens distortions that may be present in your photo. Like I mentioned before, if you're shooting with wide-angle lenses, it can sometimes distort the corners of your images, making it look rounded off. If you click this Enable Profile Corrections option and your lens that you shot the photo with shows up in this lens profile section, it will make the necessary adjustments for you. You will also notice the distortion and vignetting sliders here at the bottom. This essentially allows you to manually adjust the distortion within the image to make your own corrections if you don't like the preset ones that Lightroom gave you. Next up, we have the Transform panel. Remember when I told you there was more than one way to straighten and align your pictures? This is another panel that you can use to utilize the AI within Lightroom software to actually straighten your photos for you. You'll notice that you have a couple of different options here, as well as a few more sliders for getting your image perfectly straight. What I'll usually do is select between all of these options here until I find the one that works best for my specific scenario. Different focal lengths, different compositions, all of that will change as to which one of these settings is going to work best for aligning your shot. Here we have the effects panel, where we have yet another way to add vignette to your photo. A vignette, again, just being a dark circle around your subject or the edges of your frame. And you've also got a slider here to add grain if you, for whatever reason, want to add more noise and grain to your photo. Some people will do this to achieve an old school film look. And last but not least, you've got your calibration panel. As you can see here, there are a few more color settings. They allow you to adjust your tint in the shadows, as well as adjusting your red primary, green primary, and blue primary colors. These tools can definitely be effective for adding color into your photos, but they work essentially the same as the HSL and color panel, as well as the color grading panel. At the end of the day, it doesn't matter what panels you are using. If you're getting the end results that you're looking for, that is all that matters. So use the tone curve, don't use the tone curve. Use the calibration panel, don't use the calibration panel. At the end of the day, if you're getting the job done and you like your end result photos, that's all that matters. You also want to be keeping in mind that if you're going to be taking people on as clients, you're going to need to be operating in an efficient manner. So working in whatever way is quickest for you is obviously ideal. So now that we've gone through what each of the sliders do, let's very quickly polish up this photo and show you what it looks like. Gonna reduce some highlights here. I think I'm gonna go ahead and turn the blues up just so I can get some color back in that paint. And then what I'll do is I will make a linear gradient coming up from the top, trying to get rid of some of the saturation from the sky. Now remember, if my Lightroom is working properly, I could just use the sky selection and turn the saturation down that way, but unfortunately it's not working, so I've kind of got to do it the old school way. Already got the gradient on the bottom. This is looking a little too purple to me. I think I want to warm it up just a little bit more. Maybe turn up the saturation on the yellows. These around gives me a little bit, I kind of like that. Turn it down just a little bit. Kind of like that. Bump that up a little bit. I think turn the highlights down a little bit more. Maybe bump the shadows, get a little more detail out of the car. That was maybe a little too much. Turn the whites down. All right, I'm gonna change the yellow hue to be a bit more orange. just because that's something I'm kind of a fan of doing. A little more blue saturation. For some reason, the ground is looking like it's got some color right here. So I'm gonna turn this over, turn the saturation on the ground down. And that is going to be the end result photograph. So now that you're done, what do? Simply go up into File and click the Export setting. From here, you're gonna see a few complicated options. Don't worry, I'm gonna walk you through everything. Up here in Export Location, this is where your file is actually going. I would recommend setting this setting to specific folder and then clicking this button that says choose to choose what folder on your computer or external hard drive you would like the edited photos to go to. You can also click this put in subfolder option, which will essentially make new folders for each of your individual edited sets. For me, I separate all my raw photos into individual folders, but all of my edited stuff just goes into one big folder. Next, under file naming, just like I do with my file folders, with my actual photo files, I name them by the date. So here you'll see I have the year, the month, and then the day, and then I have the title of the photo shoot. Over here, you'll see where it says start number. This is the first photo in this example series, so I'm gonna go ahead and set it to 1. Up at the top, I have it set to custom name, otherwise the photo file is going to be named the gibberish that your camera named it. Last but not least, in file settings, I would always recommend that you have your quality set to 100 unless your clients have specific limits as to how big the photos have to be. From there, you're all done. Hit export. If you've saved the photo before, you'll get this message up here saying that you've already exported it. Simply hit overwrite and boom, you're done. Your photo is completed, it looks the way that you want, and you're ready to move on to the next photo in your set. The last tip I'm gonna give you is how to make a preset. So you've done all of this editing, it looks great, but you wanna make sure that all of your photos in the set look consistent. Simply go up to your Develop tab up here and click New Preset. Again, for me, I name everything by the date, so I'm gonna call this 1203 UBGAP Example 1. I always number them as well because throughout one set, I'm probably gonna be making anywhere between 5 to 6 presets. I go ahead and hit create, and now I can apply all of the adjustments that I've made to this photo to every single other photo in this set from Willow Springs. That is far and away one of the most time-saving tips that I can offer you guys for Adobe Lightroom. So with that being said, that is going to conclude section 6, Understanding Adobe Lightroom. I know this was a crazy long section with so much information, but Lightroom is probably far and away, other than your camera, the most important tool that you'll need to understand in order to get better as a car photographer. So just like with all the other sections, I hope you absorbed as much of this information as you possibly could. And with that being said, let's go ahead and jump to Adobe Photoshop.